Welcome back to another episode of the Sports Politika podcast, the show that takes you through the world of sports, power, and politics. I'm your host, Karim Zidane, and today I'm back with another special interview with a guest I've been clamoring to speak with, especially in the wake of the tragic events of October 7th and the continued destruction of Gaza. Over the past few months, I've been reading a lot of literature to do with Israel-Palestine. One of the books that I found most fascinating was a book by Nicholas Blincoe called More Noble Than War, A Football History of Israel-Palestine. It was an exceptional read that managed to delve into one of the most complex political subjects through a football lens, which in turn helped really bring out its humanity. So I honestly can't recommend the book enough, which is why I wanted to bring Nicholas onto the show to discuss his process and why he took on such an endeavor. This episode really does not disappoint. So, happy listening. Hi, Nicholas. It's a pleasure to have you on the Sports Politika podcast.
It's great to be here, Karim. I'm very, very excited.
As am I. Your book, honestly, I just finished it recently, More Noble Than War, A Soccer History or a Football History of Israel-Palestine. Depends which copy you get, I guess, because I'm in North America and I ended up with a soccer history, even though I don't even use the word soccer. But safe to say, it was a thrilling book. I absolutely thought it was an excellent read. And I immediately reached out because I really had to have you on the show to get into this book, to delve into it and to see how it relates to what's going on around us now.
Well, thanks so much, Karim. I really appreciate it. It was a difficult book to write in some ways, but also very rewarding. It's something I'm so glad I did delve into.
Mm-hmm. And honestly, how do you come about such a decision to write a book about football in Israel-Palestine? It's such a great idea, but how did you come to that decision?
It started. To be honest, it wasn't my idea. I was talking about it with my agent, and he'd been talking about it with an editor, and they just thought it would be a way into the topic. They knew that. To give you some background, I was married to a Palestinian woman for 20 years, and she's from Bethlehem. So we spent half of our time, moving backwards and forwards between England and Palestine. Well, I've written novels set in Bethlehem, and I've also written novels set in my hometown, which is Manchester. And I was thinking of writing something about it. And it was my agent who, in conjunction with an editor, thought that football would be a good way into it. I'd already written about football in other places. I'm a kind of a latecomer to football, which I think I speak about in the book. But I largely got into football, more into football. I got more obsessive because I was feeling homesick living in Bethlehem, and it was just a way to connect with Manchester again. So, but I didn't feel like an expert on football. Football is one of those things where people are just know so much about it and have spent their entire lives submerged in it. I just don't compare with with people we have in England like Jonathan Wilson and Jason Steinberg. And they're just fantastic. And Jonathan Liu, I just don't compare with them in terms of knowledge. But I had lived in the Middle East and I was fascinated by the football. And when the idea came up, it was really because football, and especially sporting clubs, give you an entry into really 20th century history, because every single party to the conflict on both sides and within both sides, the arguments that define the sides internally as well as against each other, every single party had a sports association. Mm-hmm. And football wasn't the only sport, but it was one of the most popular. It was really the most popular sport. So what you get when you delve into it is it's yet another political history, but I think a more interesting one in many ways because it's a grassroots history. It tells you just what it meant to be a member of a political organization, what you did, where you went, which was to the club, whether that was to meet your friends or to meet girls, but it was also to, just to play sport. And what does it mean to play sport? What does it mean to play sport in a conflict? Often in a 3 or 4-sided conflict, when the Jewish side became parts of the Jewish side became anti-British, and the Palestinians mounted their own kind of general strike. So it was a multi-sided conflict, and the players, in virtually every instance, the players in the conflict were also literally football players.
Honestly, it's fascinating, but you speak about not necessarily having this football knowledge or this breadth of knowledge, like as you mentioned, Jonathan Wilson, Jonathan Liu. I honestly think with the book, it actually works to your advantage. There's something to be said about being on the outside looking in. You're able, whilst those with the knowledge might get into the weeds a little too much and offer you not necessarily the information that you need as a reader, but you're guiding us as you're learning, as you're progressing, and teaching us along the way. So I think it actually works in your favor in this case. And you're absolutely right. In many ways, it's how I've approached sports as well. As a fan of a variety of sports, including football, I view it as a magnifying lens into the world around me. That's what you've really done here with this book. I mean, it seems to me that by focusing on football, you were really able to get into the history of and talk to people and get them to open up about things such as the creation of Israel, the Palestinian struggle. Was that the intention, or did that just so happen to work out in your favor, that people were willing to tell this history in this fashion?
God, you've put me on the spot here. I guess I wasn't sure what I expected, but I genuinely did want to tell a history. If you've lived in a Palestinian city, the occupation is all consuming. It's there every single day. So you're not going to equivocate about various terms about occupation and apartheid even. Because these are the best words to describe the absolute anxiety of every single day. But I genuinely wanted to write a history. I didn't want to twist events or anything. So I guess I went about it with an open heart and an open mind. And because I had specific questions, I did. To be fair, I found all the Israelis I spoke to very helpful. I think in retrospect, some of them have been slightly cooler to me once the book was written, but they were all incredibly helpful. and certainly on the Palestinian side. And it also, I guess this is, I know Palestinians of the West Bank well, and I really should have gone more into Gaza, which I didn't do, and then it became impossible to. But I'd never, aside from some relatives of my wife, I'd never really met that many Israeli, Palestinians of Israel, and it was just fascinating meeting the people who ran the Jaffa Football Club and whose families had been running it since the 1920s. So that became one of the spines through the book, because you do need you always need a through story. And by finding basically a family who'd been playing football, or been running a football club since 1929, that was just amazing.
Well, you're getting into here about how sort of the process of researching and writing this book and the type of sources you encountered. What was the difference? And you kind of highlighted it here between the Israeli sources you spoke to and the Palestinian ones. It seems to me, since we're talking about occupation, etc., it must have been easier to access information from the Israeli side, I'd say, right, than it was the Palestinians.
Yeah, you asked me how I found researching, and it's one of the facts of, of living under an occupation, that virtually all of the information was in Israel. it's not entirely true that there's a great historian called Issam Halidi who'd written a book, 100 Years of Football in Palestine. And some of the schools and people I spoke to had their own records. But really, I was going again and again to Israeli archives. And this was particularly frustrating because the main archive for all sport in Israel is the Wingate Institute. And Ord Wingate is just a horrendous character. He was a British soldier who set up the night squadrons, which were responsible for kidnapping and torturing Palestinians during the general strike. So, every time, he's not an Israeli, he's not Jewish, he's just basically an English psychopath. So every time I'm looking for information, I'm looking at the Wingate Institute. But I mean, the information was there. There were newspaper archives in Israel. Oddly, one of the main players in Israel in the 1920s went on to write an extremely idiosyncratic who's who of everybody in what was then called the Yishuv, pre-state Israel. And he'd been a policeman, he'd been a sportsman, and then he was a private detective, and he basically knew everybody. And so he wrote this incredibly gossipy who's who of them all. And that was all online. And that became one of my main sources. It's a subject of study in Israeli universities. So I spoke to professors who'd written books on it, and there were obviously plenty of journalists, and journalists were very helpful. So, the information often was coming from Israeli sources, and Arab language newspapers weren't preserved in the same way. I mean, I really relied on Issam Halidi's book. But having said all that, I hope I managed to get to draw. Well, it's not a full picture because I really could have gone into the sports associations of Palestine more, but it is what it is, as they say.
I can understand that language barrier might have been an issue here as well. I don't know if you speak either Hebrew or Arabic, but was that, as someone, I asked the question really because it interests me as someone who has done reporting on countries that I don't speak the language, for instance, Russia, where I spent a lot of time, had to slowly pick up the language here and there, but I'm nowhere near the speed I am or ability in the language as English or Arabic. So I know it slowed me down when I was doing work. Did you have these issues, or was that compensated for by the people you spoke to?
Oh no, that's absolutely a problem for me. I've spent so long there, and I don't really speak in any fluent way at all. I mean, I just bumble by, and actually I have no Hebrew whatsoever. But it was a case again of Google Translate. You can put as long as all the stuff is online somewhere, which it was in Israel. You can put it through a computer, and the computers were getting better and better just as I was writing. And also, I speak English, and so everybody in the world speaks English, which was handy.
That's absolutely beneficial. And of course, when it comes to the Arabic sources, you're talking about them not being preserved so well. This is something I've seen going through archives in Egypt, where I'm from. Unfortunately, a lot of the Arabic sources are not preserved very well, and it becomes harder to scan them, to translate them. All that effort that's put into these other languages to sort of digitize and store them is not really there at the same level with Arabic language. We're seeing universities pick up on that now, but we've got years and years before this breadth of knowledge that we have on the Arab world actually is readily available to new scholars and writers. So I absolutely empathize with that being an issue with the book. But still, with that being said, you bring up a lot of fascinating things that I did not even know. For instance, just a quick one off the top of my head was this idea that football for Palestinians in 1920 and pre-1920 was an elite sport and used as a tool of diplomacy. I find that so fascinating, especially when you contrast it with the fact that the early Jewish teams were more isolationist, let's say. So talk to me about that a bit, please. I found it fascinating.
Yes. So the history of football in Israel and Palestine, or in the Yishuv, as the pre-state Israel was called, and Palestine, it's really a parallel track because they weren't really playing each other. And as they evolved in their own ways, football wasn't that big in the Jewish community. They were coming from Russia, and it just wasn't really a game they played all that much. But as it got popular, they did start kicking it around, but it wasn't important to them. In fact, what was really important was a kind of rhythmic gymnastics that were drills for basically for to build military organizations. They were already thinking, the Yishuv was already thinking in terms of building up a self-defense and also an offensive capability through its teenagers, already from like 1908, 1910. And this mirrors the similar self-defense military style organizations in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and places. So the founders of the sports associations, like the Maccabi, are really doing drills. They're doing military drills, and football was a kind of side thought. Kids played it because kids liked football, but it didn't really take off. Whereas the strange thing, in the big public schools in Jerusalem and Haifa and places, they did start playing football immediately, and obviously they were elite. This is Edward Said was one of them. And plenty of other people who became the great politician of the 1920s were schoolboys in 1910, and they all played football. It was diplomatic insofar as they went to play football in Lebanon with the college that became the American University in Beirut. They played with the great public school in Egypt. That's Victoria College. And then once the British took over, they started playing the British. So yes, it was. There's a few photographs, so they were getting large crowds, but it was really, what you'd think of in England for more like Eton and Winchester, a game played by toffs that the working class might look at as a spectacle, but was really to further their own ambitions, their sense of self, their sense of destiny, that they really were hoping to take control of Britain. It really was the elite. I don't know whether your audience particularly knows Palestine, but there was a kind of aristocracy especially based around Jerusalem.
Al-Husseini family, the Barghouti families, of course, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, they really are a kind of an aristocracy. So it was that they were the people who were first of all playing football. Although that does change by the 1920s, and it changes. It changes for the Yishuv, the Jewish community, because it stops really being a Russian colony, which is all the Yishuv around Jaffa was until after the Second World War. And it starts because of the British promise to build a Jewish homeland there. It becomes a place that Jews in the big cities of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire can think, well, nothing's happening here. We're discriminated against. There's no work. There's no country even. Nationalism's on the rise. We could do something else. So you get this wave of immigration to Palestine, and the people emigrating, they're not you know fairly ideological and religious Russians. They're just workers, and they bring football with them. So football takes off as a working class pursuit in the 1920s. In the 1920s, Yishuv. But the same's true in Palestine, amongst Palestinians, because political parties start to get formed, and they wonder how to bring in the youth. And football is just growing and growing in popularity, especially through things like the influence of Egypt, where the great teams at Cairo pretty much were the forces behind the revolution, and they were certainly aware of that in Palestine.
I think you made so many interesting points there, two of which was, for me, thinking about football. And you're absolutely right. When you think about football, you think of it as a working class sport, especially in the Arab world. We're taught that this is the sport that unites us all, no matter the class or the hierarchy. At least that's the romanticized notion, of course, of football, let's say. But you're absolutely right. It might, even in Egypt, that is unlikely to have been the case pre-revolution in the 1950s, or at least there was significant tension between, say, Al Ahly, which was seen as the workers' football club in Egypt, and Zamalek, which was the bourgeois aristocratic club. That sort of dies down now in modern times as you think about football. But really, yes, that shift is very significant in Egypt, and of course, I can see how it will influence Palestine as well. The other point I think is really fascinating that you made is this connection between Israel's interest in sports and the military, and how those two elements connect, and that football really didn't play that role early on. Do you think that has shifted for Israel, or does it still view other sports as those masculine sports? Like, you have autocracies around the world that associate themselves with, say, combat sports because they see it as the more hyper masculine and macho sport to associate with. Where does Israel fall on this militarily, you think? Where has football come to be now?
Everyone I spoke to in Jewish Israel stressed that it wasn't the most popular sport. That doesn't mean that the other sports are more militaristic, but the extent to which Israel is Russian can never really be overstated. So, ice hockey is an important sport. Basketball, I mean, again, that's a very Russian and a very American sport. And basketball, I think everyone would agree it's the biggest sport in Israel. But because football is the global sport, and Israel keeps changing, keeps modernizing, that is changing. Israel is getting more football mad, but it's still not the main sport. And certainly, going back to the 1920s, 1930s, it was this kind of gymnastics players that were the big sport. And then both the Jewish Yishuv and the Palestinians were keen on boxing, which is militaristic, it's self-defense. So boxing was always big. And if you look at the Palestinian sports clubs, it's boxing and football and nothing else. Whereas the Yishuv sports societies were, it was basketball and then football as a secondary sport, and boxing, lots of boxing. And, there were people played tennis. But, I think, again, tennis was more of the Shishi sports clubs, like the YMCA in Jerusalem.
Interesting. Oh, sorry, go right ahead.
Yeah, I was just still trying to think about the military side of it. There were military-esque teams, like police teams and things like that, going back before the creation of the State of Israel. And they did play football because they were part of the British administration. And, if you're part of the British administration, you play football. I don't know why cricket never took off, but I suspect it's because the ground just isn't very good for cricket. Although that never stopped Indians. Maybe they just didn't like it.
I was gonna say, if this is so much British influence, why no rugby? Why no cricket? How did that not make its way over in the same way? But that's a bit of a side question here. But it's something definitely
Yeah.
that was on my mind.
I suspect one of the reasons might be that it was always a military occupation. So the
Mhm.
soldiers were just normal working class soldiers.
Mm.
I think the other thing is that there just isn't much grass in
Yeah.
Palestine. So nobody wants to be diving around on the ground. So I can see why rugby didn't take off. I've got no idea why cricket didn't, but um, I think because football had already established itself, certainly amongst Palestinians, it was already establishing itself before the British took over.
And it feels like football has always been a sport that finds a way to weave itself into political narratives and into society
Mm,
in very interesting ways.
mm,
We mentioned the aristocracies in Palestine and Al Husseinis playing football as kids, basically these members, and
mm,
would go on to have these positions of authority in Jerusalem and elsewhere in the following years. I'm also thinking a lot of uh, Israeli clubs like Beitar Jerusalem, which technically predates Israel, but
mm.
uh, that's uh, that's a club with a fascinating history, right? Because it's associated
Yeah.
with revisionist Zionism and sort of predates the Likud party
Mm,
and it continues to maintain significant influence now and as known for quite controversial fans that they
mm.
have. So, how do you think something like Beitar fits into all of this, and from its history back in Israel, when with its founding all the way till now?
Mm. Well, it's a fascinating story. Betar is the youth organization of revisionist Zionism. I don't know whether any of your listeners are really familiar with what revisionist Zionism is. It's the roots of the Likud party, but before that, it was the right wing party,
Hmm.
and it was entering a crowded field because there already was a right wing party. The Liberal Party, Jewish Liberal Party, was fairly right wing and had the Maccabees, and there was a left wing party, which is the Israeli Labour Party.
Hmm.
Um, so when we talk about the revisionist Zionist Party, we're talking about an extreme right wing organisation, and um, it develops in different countries. In Poland, you can find photographs of them wearing brown military paramilitary uniforms, goose stepping around. So clearly a fascist style party. Um, but in the Yishuv, in pre-state Israel, it it one one better kind of club started in Jaffa, but it didn't have much of a history. What really happened was that a group that was based in Jerusalem set up set up a new political organization, and Betar was part of that. And the reason that this kind of cell in Jerusalem is significant is because, I mean, the leaders of the group were happy to call themselves fascists at the time. They were the Jewish Fascist Party of Israel, not of Israel, the Jewish Fascist Party of the Yishuv, I guess. Um, and one of them was Netanyahu's father, Ben Zion Netanyahu. He was the editor of a newspaper. It was a pre-existing newspaper. I think it was called something like the Daily Mail, but it was bought, and it's kind of shadowy how they managed to buy it. This a kind of small political cell, but they were often educated in Italy, which was a fascist state at the time. Um, that some of the leaders of it were recruited from universities in Italy, and later on they were funded. They were directly funded by Mussolini's Italy. So this is a very hard right group, using the terms fascism and setting up a small cell in Jerusalem. And they set up Betar Football Club. I mean, it's the youth club, the youth sports association of a fairly small political organization based in Jerusalem. Well, when the general strike started from like 1935 onwards, 1936, there really wasn't much communication around the country. You just all the buses and things stopped, and because of strikes and because of violence from all three sides, the British, the Palestinian strikers, and the Jewish terrorism, in fact, there was no real movement around the country. And Betar was kind of stranded in Jerusalem, and virtually the entire Yishuv lived on the coast. This is quite a long story, but it does. I'm trying to say that Betar grew up on its own, separate from the institutions of the Yishuv, and was extremely hard right and was a terrorist organization. It's the association that the Stern Gang, Lehi, the organizations that, Stern never renounced fascism until his death. He was killed. He was still committing acts of terrorism during the Second World War and was killed during his arrest by the British. Most of these guys ended up being arrested for terrorism by the time the Second World War started. When the Second World War started, the Yishuv under Ben Gurion declared it was really open season on them. They weren't, prior to that point, they'd not grasped them up to the British authorities, but after that moment, they were willing to because of the Second World War, basically. So they all ended up, they were the terrorists responsible for things like the bombing of the King David Hotel. And they all ended up in prison camps in Kenya and places where they continued to play sports. So Betar was a sports organization in prison camps in Africa. And after the declaration of Israel and when the war started, they all started coming back. And then I'm joining the paramilitary associations. And by this time, the leader of the Polish Betar,
Begin?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that was. I couldn't believe I forgot. Begin was in charge of the of the right wing paramilitaries by the time by 1948, and when the Jerusalem Betar people came back, they joined what Begin would later call the Fighting Family. Meaning all these various terrorist organizations were grouped under the umbrella of Begin's organization. And slowly, over the years, Begin's organization evolved into Likud. I mean, it was really formed in the 1960s, 1960s, when Ariel Sharon got the Israeli Liberal Party, which was the centre-right party, to join, and that became the modern-day Likud party. So because of that, there are different ways of talking about the history of Likud. You can say it's a Polish party, or you can say it has its roots in revisionist Zionism. But for the contemporary party under Benjamin Netanyahu really has its roots in Betar Jerusalem, which is why it's so important to Israeli identity, this club, which incidentally isn't this kind of European pre-state club anymore, because Jerusalem became the place where Middle Eastern Jews moved to, and they adopted the club. But it's still by far the most right-wing club. It's got a history that takes it right back to people who would describe themselves as fascists. And, as the famous poster famous banner rather in the stands held up by the ultras says, that they're racist and proud, that they're pure, forever pure. That's the slogan of Betar.
It says a lot about the club and its history. It is a fascinating, if not slightly disturbing, history, but it does infuse football and Israeli politics together from a
Mm.
very, very, very early period. It also is a reflection of the sentiments of ethno-nationalism that you find within Israeli
Mm.
politics, especially on the right. I think overall it's fascinating, but correct me if I'm wrong here. It feels like Beitar would have been, especially early on, one of the clubs that would have wanted to compete with others. If we're talking about a lot of early on, a lot of these Jewish football clubs that are
Mm.
emerging were isolationist. Some of them had, Jewish immigrants, etc. Or sorry, Russian immigrants, etc. I think it's really interesting. Beitar would want to show superiority over Arab teams, wouldn't they? That would be
Yeah,
part of their narrative.
yeah. I mean, this is the peculiar thing. As you say, clubs like Maccabi played other Maccabi clubs.
Hmm.
They were an international sports association of Jews, so they just played Jews. That was why they existed. The Labour Party had its own sports association um, because they found Maccabi, it was controlled by people they didn't like. So they had their own Labour one, and they competed with international Labour organisations, but um, basically just played their own clubs and occasionally played Maccabi clubs or tried to negotiate with the Maccabi clubs to form leagues.
Hmm.
And this is happening throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s. But the thing with Betar, they were stranded in Jerusalem and they had no one to play.
Hmm.
And they wanted to play, as you say, they wanted to play Arab teams. They wanted to show their superiority. And the British encouraged this, whether that was because they hoped that by encouraging matches, they would led to fellow feeling and peace. I think that's what they
Diplomacy.
said. Yes, that's how they excused it to themselves. But they also allowed, even after some really quite serious bombing campaigns had started, led by Betar Jerusalem, they continued to allow matches to go ahead because they had spotters in the crowd trying to find the leaders of the Jewish terrorists. So these
Incredible.
matches went ahead at like the YMCA in Jerusalem. They were playing all of the Islamic and Christian football clubs. That and yes, as you say, that they really wanted to play Arabs and show their superiority.
And that streak of anti-Arabness, I guess,
Mm.
continues to fuel that club. At least, let's say it's ultras groups, the La
Mm.
Familia,
Yeah.
who I believe as at the start of the most recent iteration of the war in Gaza with Israel, which started after October 7th. I believe it was La Familia fans who stormed the hospital where there was a rumor that Hamas fighters were being treated in a hospital in Israel. It was just the most bizarre story because you'd see this incident, you'd think, "Oh, how is this happening in Israel?" And it was Israeli fans who were doing it, who was creating this riot basically, and they were Betar fans. And they still carry that influence. Nothing happened to these people. They weren't arrested. They didn't go
Mm.
anywhere. They just continue to hold that kind of sway in the country as if they're as you say they believe that they're pure, and many people believe in their cause, so they're just led to do whatever they feel like.
Yes. Well, I mean, it is the case that right wing, what again we would call terrorism, doesn't really get punished in Israel. It doesn't mean there isn't opposition to it. That
Of
there
course.
are football teams set up to rival Betar, but um, they've never really gained traction in Jerusalem, which has become an increasingly right wing city. And Betar, as I keep saying, it's part
Mhm.
of the DNA of the most powerful part of the Likud.
Really
Uh,
fascinating stuff. I still think that beyond Bitar, football played such a significant role for both Palestine and Israel, especially as we move forward into modern times. I think about this a lot, especially in the wake of the ongoing conflict right now and the responses from the international sports communities. I always find it so interesting that really the first international organization to recognize Palestine was FIFA in 1998. Like,
I know. That's extraordinary, isn't it?
absolutely.
I mean, we talk about FIFA being, the most corrupt organization in the world, but um, that's a high bar when there's a lot of corrupt organizations in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of wild that FIFA seems to have done more for pride in the developing world and in conflict zones than perhaps any other. And perhaps we need to do a revisionist account of FIFA and some of its kind of lieutenants. But again, the leader of the FA guy in Palestine is Jibril Rajib, who's an incredibly controversial figure. And he was there in 1998 celebrating. So he clearly had something to do with, he would take all the credit because he's the kind of politician who is adept at taking all the credit. But he clearly had something to do with persuading FIFA to recognize Palestine so early on. And then several years later, after he'd been the head of the secret police, he became the head of the FA in Palestine, and he still is the head. He really gets on the nerves of people who love football, but at the same time, Palestine has entrusted one of its most adept politicians with running the FA, and it's not as though he runs it day to day. He's the guide of it, but it's got incredibly competent people. I mean, Suzanne Shalaby is an extremely competent administrator. And it's thanks to people like her that Palestinian football runs as smoothly as it does in very, very difficult circumstances.
But what does it say about the nature of football and how they view it in Palestine that they would place such a controversial and infamous politician in charge of the FA? What does it say about their perception of football for Palestine and what it represents abroad?
Yes, and you can read it in two different ways, I guess. I mean, football's important because football's important. It's the sport that Palestinians really love, and they like their own football teams. They really love Barca, they really love Brazil, but they also really they love their local teams, and the teams are getting support. Getting a genuine following, especially in cities like Hebron, which has several teams, and Nablus. And Nablus has a great team. So Ramallah has a good team. But especially places like Hebron, football is everything there. So one reason football's taken seriously is because football's taken seriously. It's a popular sport, but it's also an international sport, and it gives Palestine a platform it might not otherwise have, which is why you've got figures like Jibril Rajib going into it. He's still got enough juice in the Palestinian political firmament to kind of shoulder his way into a place where he's got a platform, he's got a territory he can control. So, it's both a tribute to his power as a politician, but it's also a tribute, a side effect of football being so important internationally that, a truly, a competent politician is there.
So interesting. I think really football at the end of the day is a powerful tool for soft power. And even Palestine with its in comparison to many other countries in the world, its weakened position politically is in many ways heightened by the use of football, as we're seeing right now, amidst this horrific bombardment that we're seeing. 28,000 so far people in Gaza have been killed by Israeli airstrikes, etc. Yet one of the things that was discussed and watched uh, dearly by people around the world was Palestine's performance at the AFC Asian Cup just a few weeks ago. I mean, what a performance from them then! And what do we make of this team's ability to go and perform in a place like this, despite all the restrictions of just getting out of the country?
No, it's extraordinary. I find I'm always amazed by it. Every performance by Palestine seems to exceed expectations. There's a commentator called Basil McDadis who is perhaps the best person on Palestinian football, and I mean it's kind of romantic to see a national spirit in a team, but he argues that there is one in Palestine. You know that their nickname is the Fidai, if I pronounce that correctly,
the Commandos,
which is the root of the word Fedayeen, who are the Palestinian commandos, but also means the steadfast.
Of course.
And it means that it means people just will not be defeated, and that's what it means to Palestinians. And Basil argues that the kind of super typical Palestinian football player will always be the goalkeeper. And
that's interesting.
He's the last line of defense. So whatever happens, you won't get through him. Palestinian football often has a reputation for being ultra defensive. It's the kind of football that, if you're English, you might associate with a club like the old Wimbledon, where they were big, they were aggressive, and they were defensive. I think that's changing. We've certainly got some skillful players now, and because Palestine, because of the circumstances, Palestinians have to make their way across the world just to earn a living. I guess they can draw on a talented squad who've got experience in other countries, but it's always amazing that they perform as well as they do, and getting out of the group stages, I think, was just a huge achievement.
A historic achievement that really rallied so much support from around Asia and the Middle East and internationally. Really, it was really quite wonderful to behold. It's one of those rare times, really, you're watching sports, you're like, look at the story that's being told. And I'm someone who's such a cynic generally when it comes to sports and the sports stores. I always think it's just romanticized, sort of bits and pieces, sort of parceled up and branded and sold to us so that we can stay entertained. But every once in a while, a real story comes around, and that one was one I followed very closely. But there's a flip side to it that I think, again, the cynic within me, and I believe, Nicholas, you're a Man City fan, right?
Yes.
Is it Man City? Yes. So, okay, so this question really falls to you as well. I think one of the things I did notice during this Cup and elsewhere since then and before then was that there's a growing influence of Gulf states on Palestinian affairs in general, and really including football. For instance, Qatar was hosting this AFC Asian Cup. What we saw this time really was an interesting use of soft power for them, where they really wanted to present themselves as this leading ally for Palestine. They dedicated the tournament to Palestine. The revenues from the event are supposed to be reportedly being dedicated to humanitarian causes in Gaza. This is Qatar really outwardly using football to show its dedication to Palestine, even though it plays the role technically of a neutral in mediation affairs. I thought that was fascinating. We're seeing Saudi Arabia trying to set up itself as a training base for Palestinian players. There's reports going on right now, and who knows if this is going to be true, that the Palestinian athletes on those teams are going to be designated as locals in Qatar, so they'd have some sort of freedom to move around in Qatar. This is very significant politics for me, I find. And as someone who has never really trusted in historically Gulf states in particular's role when it comes to Palestine, I don't necessarily see this as a positive. I wonder how you feel about this. Or if you have any.
I've got mixed feelings. I mean, the fact is, Saudi Arabia has had an outsized influence on Palestine, and it's been very difficult because they need the money, and it's difficult to say. Well, it's impossible to say no to Saudi Arabia in many ways because they're one of the few countries that have got some diplomatic heft, and they're one of the few countries that have got, at the time, one of the few countries that got money and were willing to spend it in Palestine. At least what happens when you've got more competition, Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and so on, is that a country like Palestine can kind of play people off against each other and hopefully develop some kind of foreign policy. That's not just about football, that's in general. There aren't many cards in a Palestinian's hand, and the more it's able to move between groups, it's going to be a slight advantage. There was a big scandal. I'm thinking back to a scandal about about the time I was writing the book, where Saudi Arabia had pledged a lot of money to the Palestinian football team, and then offered them a coach, and it meant that Palestine had to kind of sack its coach and take this coach who turned out not to be a great success. So then Jibril Rajoub had to sack him while still trying to keep the Saudi money, and it was just genuinely a real mess. So
did this mess involve Turkish Sheikh by any chance? Sorry to interrupt you, but did this involve Turkish Sheikh? Because this sounds like something that would involve Turkish Sheikh.
Yes, yeah, it did. And I think it was just coming to a head as the book was going to press. So fortunately, I didn't have to go into it all, but it was just horrendous, and nobody came out of it well. And it really shook up Palestinian football. Fortunately, not for too long, but it put the team backwards. So I guess what I'm saying is that if you've got Qatar in competition with Saudi Arabia, at least you've got more freedom of movement, perhaps. And as you say, I'm a Manchester City supporter, which in England can often be hugely controversial. I mean, the kind of things that get shouted at Manchester City fans are that we bought our success, and people suddenly become experts in the foreign policy of the United Arab Emirates, and quoting back at you. There is issues there of sports washing, but when you start scratching at the surface, each country has its own agenda, and mixing them all up as what Arabs do is bigotry. They're different countries, they've got different agendas, and that tends to be a good thing, at least for Palestine, because they've got a variety of players they can go to. It's not just Saudi Arabia.
You're really absolutely right here. I've been such a big proponent of us not using the term sports washing anymore. As somebody who was guilty of using it in the past, I don't think a key word can describe the nuances and complexities of the political goals and the economic goals and the historical context involved in each of these varying countries. But there's a reason I mentioned Qatar and Saudi rather than, say, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, where I see a clear hypocrisy between them trying to maintain ties with Palestinians. And there's a lot of Palestinian immigrants in both those countries that do very well for themselves and are appreciative of those countries for giving them homes for such a long time. But then these are the same countries that went to normalize relations with Israel without consulting their populations in any way, shape, or form. These were political goals, and then Bahrain has the gall to say, "Come, Palestine, play a friendly game with us in solidarity." I think that is walking a very fine line, and I don't know how many people are falling for it. I think the ones that are more successful right now are Qatar, which has always sort of been the rebel of the Gulf region, going against the grain, and of course Saudi Arabia, which, as you mentioned, has some serious leverage right now. Israel would love to normalize relations with Saudi, and suddenly Saudi's in a position where it can actually demand for a Palestinian state, potentially. This is at least what appears to be the case right now. So I think you combine that political aspect with how it's playing out on a football pitch, and I think the correlation is significant there, especially with those two countries. As to what happens, I'm not 100% sure. But this really leads me, Nicholas, to sort of the final question, and I'm going to put you on the spot a bit here because we talk about, or at least your wonderful book, right, is about a football history of Israel and Palestine. I'll ask you now, what do you think the role of football should be as we see this unfolding conflict in front of us right now, this war in Gaza, what people are calling a genocide and apartheid and displacement of Gazans? Is there really a role for football at all in this? Should there be?
Well, yes, I think there is, but it's. I mean, going back to what I said when we started, the reason that there's football in Israel and Palestine is that every single political party had a youth movement. So it's not as though football and politics are separate. They've always been completely intertwined, and it largely follows the money. It's often as corrupt as the countries where it's being played, but you can't divorce it from politics, and it is a platform for dissent and for for the oppressed to have a voice, and that means it's also a platform for people to call for boycotts. It's, as somebody who lived through the South African apartheid era, it seems to me self-evident that the boycotts were crucial. And as South Africa seems to be stepping up for Palestine again, and I don't know if you know that Palestine sent its national football team to go and play some friendlies in South Africa.
Again, the symbolism, right? Incredible stuff.
Incredible. So yes, I think football will always play a role, but it's more the role of calling for boycotts, I think, right at this moment.
Absolutely. And with that, honestly, Nicholas, this has been a wonderful chat. I've taken up an hour of your time, and I don't think I want to take up any more of it. But I do want to tell readers that if anything, if you've enjoyed this conversation in any way, shape, or form, I could not recommend enough Nicholas's book, More Noble Than War, A Football History of Israel-Palestine. It was a remarkable read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it was fascinating. For a book that's supposed to be purely fact-based, it really reads like an incredible novel, something that you're going to pick up and not put down, and something that I'm going to be using as a blueprint as I sit down to write my own book in the near future. So thank you for that, Nicholas, honestly. And thank you for the effort and time that you've put into this book. Really, it's an incredible read.
That's so kind, Kareem, and thanks for having me on here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.